I want to welcome everyone, and I want to especially thank Essie for joining us tonight as our local bread making expert. We're really happy to have her. And just in case you guys don't know who I am, my name's Courtney Schober, and I'm the educational coordinator at Farmhouse Classroom, amongst other things in the community. Emily's on here. She just wished me good luck it's a little over a week until Penn Street Market opens, and that's one of my other gigs as managing that downtown market. So we are opening with all the social distancing and all of the rules. So if you guys want to come down and visit, we have our two main produce vendors down there on Thursdays from 10 to 2. So I'll give a little pitch for Penn Street Market, and we run all through the summer. So today we're going to be talking about sourdough bread to continue May's fermentation topics. And we have Essie Schultz with us today from Good Grain Bread Company. Thank you, Essie, so much for being here, and I will let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be meeting with you, at least virtually. Bread making dates back to very, very ancient civilizations, to really the earliest human civilizations. Archaeologists have excavated sites in Jordan that date 14,000 years ago, and they've uncovered hearts with evidence of bread making. So it really takes us so much farther back than we previously thought. For many, many years, we thought that bread making was invented in ancient Egypt. Bread making, in the way we think of it, as an leavened bread, probably was. It could have been a byproduct of their beer making practices, or it could have just been a naturally occurring phenomenon that they discovered with the weather there, leaving some dough out, and it ferments in exactly the same way that we do today. So it really has been part of human culture and civilization as long as we've been gathering ourselves. The bread culture in Egypt was so important that around the ancient world, they were actually called bread eaters. Many, many Egyptians were paid with bread. Their wages were bread. And so it was a center port of their culture. So bread making expanded from there throughout the region. It really gained steam in ancient Greece, traveled through Italy, and really spread through Europe up until the Germanic tribes invaded, and that's when the bread culture kind of dissipates for a little while. Stone milling, that began in around 800 BC in Mesopotamia. So stone milling really hasn't changed very much as far as technology. So back then, in much the same way, two large stones circling, grinding the grain, and that was their very rustic mill. In the 18th century is really when things began to change. So in the late 18th century, Oliver Evans was the first person to invent the first automatic mill, and this was powered by water. It really increased the productivity, but only produced whole grain flour. In 1865, in Hungary, the first steam roller. So a roller mill is like two steel cylinders that crush the grain. And so that also, kind of took a step further. And roller milling is the primary way that we use, that we mill today, particularly in America. So these two were combined. So the mill in Hungary, they didn't have any mechanism for sifting. So it did increase productivity, but all of that was hand sifted. And so that was incredibly labor intensive. So in 1875, these two mills were combined and created a new roller mill. And so this roller mill could clean the grain. It was fed between these steel rollers, and this would break the grain, crush it, and it would roll it again, roll it again, and roll it again, and be sifted. So the bran will drop down, and what is left is, the white flour. So this becomes really important as culture changes in Europe. Before this combination mill was invented, during the Industrial Revolution, people's taste for leavened bread really began to change. And this is very much connected with the aristocracy. So the upper class wanted white bread, and the working class had wholemeal bread. So it created, a desire for other people to have white bread. But as as I said, it was so labor intensive to sift all of that bran out. It was very, very costly. So many people didn't have access to this very refined flour. So in this Industrial Revolution, the tins were also made, and commercial yeast was invented. So those three things coming together really creates the scene for what we think of as bread. So before these things come together, before roller mills, before commercial yeast, and before like aluminum tins, that like a loaf pan, our bread was very rustic. They were hearth breads. It was all sourdough. It was all naturally leavened. So the commercial yeast allowed bakers to quickly produce breads. The roller mills allowed the masses to have white breads, and the tins allowed it to be used in a different way. And so now we have sandwich bread. So keep fast forwarding through the 18 and 1900s, and we have a very shelf-stable bread as well. So that's what we've come to identify as what bread is. So that's just sort of a little snippet of the history of where it started and how we've come to this point. So doing this to create a standardized product, the diversification of wheat was intentionally eliminated. And that is to create one type of bread that you can get state to state, nationwide, internationally, so forth. So by using these roller mills and eliminating the bran and the germ and the oil, basically all of those nutrients fall away. And what is left is essentially the endosperm, and that's the proteins and the carbohydrates. So this probably was not intentional at all. They did start fortifying, adding back in a lot of the vitamins and minerals, but it doesn't come close to where it was originally. And then, of course, it's also loaded with other things to make it shelf stable. The sourdough, the transformation from the sourdough culture to using commercial yeast also really dramatically changes the bread. So we've changed many varieties of wheat down to very few. We've also changed the way that we're using the mill, so that changes the nutrition. And then we're also changing the culture. We're taking away the lactic acid bacteria and replacing it with yeast. And we're going to go more in depth about lactic acid bacteria and why that's important and how that transforms the bread. So in my opinion, the lactic acid bacteria is really the key to sourdough bread. That's what's making it different than a yeasted bread, nutritionally, flavor-wise, and with digestion as well. Are there any kind of questions, or anybody want to jump in before we kind of move along?
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody that if, while Essie is talking, if something sparks like a question and you don't want to interrupt her, you can type it in and I'll field questions to Essie. But does anybody have any at the moment? You could, right now, since there's a break, you could unmute yourself if you want to ask something. Give a few seconds if anybody at this point wants to, in the juncture, wants to add anything or ask a question. Go for it.
Okay, so please feel free to jump in if there's anything that comes to mind. So sourdough basics. Traditionally, a sourdough bread's going to contain 3 ingredients. That's flour, water, and salt. So the sourdough culture, all it is a mixture of flour and water. And when we mix that culture, it naturally captures the ambient yeast in the air. So what grows on your raspberries, that fuzz, that's a yeast strain. It's just in the air. So that gets just mixed in and absorbed by the flour and the water. The lactic acid bacteria is the other part of that culture, and that is the most important and by far the most prevalent. So lactic acid bacteria outnumbers the yeast strands about 100 to 1. So that comes from a variety of places. It comes from the baker's hands. It comes from the environment. It comes from the grain itself. And there's a really interesting study that traces back the lactic acid bacteria strains from the grain to the wheat to the soil. And so you can really tell how important the starting point is and how that directly affects our bodies, because we can trace these, microorganisms right from the starting point. So that is what sourdough culture is: flour, water, naturally occurring yeast, naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria. So this is, it's a community of microorganisms that, it's like microfarming that we develop, and we feed regularly. And as you feed it and as you keep it active, it will be very lively and strong and perform more consistently for you.
Essie, there was a quick question. Where the smell, like that sour smell, comes from, is that bacteria doing its work?
Fantastic. That is actually, the sourdough smell is actually a byproduct of, and the taste is a byproduct of the lactic acid bacteria. Yeah, great question. It does, so this microorganism, it creates an environment that is acidic. So it does have that tangy taste, but it is really amazing because the pH of that only allows itself to grow. So nothing funky is going to grow in there. Everything else will die away, and it will only be left with what it's supposed to be. So if that pH is just perfect. It's too acidic for any other strand of anything to be growing in it. So when this culture is healthy and active, you're going to see it's going to be bubbly, and it's going to be, I wish I was with you. I don't know if how easy this is going to be. It's going to be like kind of gooey and stick. This was fed today. So that's kind of the consistency that it is. And I don't know if you can see bubbles or not. But so that's kind of like the goo of sourdough culture. And so this little micro community is going to be creating carbon dioxide. And so that is going to be what leavens our bread. So the other 2 ingredients are the flour and the water, or the salt. And the flour and the water and the culture. So that's all coming together as our ingredients for the bread. Hi, buddy. So here, the first step is just to mix your flour and your water. And I have some freshly milled, again, I wish I was with you, some freshly milled whole wheat flour. And I don't know if you can see, like, hold on, let me tip you around. See, like, the specks. You can see I keep everything in my flour. So it's got all the bran and the germ and the oils. And you can smell the difference and see it. You can see the little flakes of bran in there. So so the first step in bread making is to scale out your ingredients. And if you don't have a kitchen scale, I do recommend getting one. They're pretty affordable around town and online. Because this is going to give you really exact, consistent results. And so you're going to scale out your flours and scale out your water and scale out your starter. And then so you can dissolve your starter in your water and mix it all together. So one of the most common pitfalls in bread making is freaking out because it's so sticky. You're going to have like a glove of dough. It's really, really sticky, but don't add more flour. So just scrape it off, and we're going to give it time. So in sourdough bread making, time is your best friend. So once that is all mixed up, it's going to be a shaggy mess. You're going to let it rest and then add your salt. So salt does two things. It adds flavor, and it also conditions the dough. So it kind of helps smooth it out. It is supposed to be, here we go. Let me show you. So after some time, after you add some salt, and this has been sitting for about an hour, it's going to be like really kind of silky and stretchy. And this is sort of, that classic window pane test, if you guys have heard of that or done that in your home kitchens. So this is going to bring us into talking a little bit about gluten, which might be a scary word to some of you guys. Let's see that? Now it's starting to break. But this is what gluten looks like. Gluten it's two proteins, two protein chains.
Essie, before you get started on gluten, can I ask for a clarification?
Yeah.
So when you were talking about adding the flour and the water together and your starter, the question was about where the salt comes in that. Is it after it sits for a while, or is it, okay.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes.
No problem.
You're going to add you're going to dissolve your starter in the water, then mix it into the flour. And so all that's in there is your flour, your water, your starter. Then I would recommend letting it rest for a little while. And so what that does is it allows the gluten to sort of get a head start before the salt. See, salt naturally slows yeast down. So it just gives it a little bit of a kickstart to get going. And then you're going to incorporate the salt
after the rest. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Sure, absolutely. So any other comments or about, let me just back up a little bit before I go on to gluten, because I want to show you a little bit of grains. So the grain scene is getting really exciting, well, to me, at least. I'm a bread nerd. Washington State University is doing some really amazing things, bringing back a lot of heirloom grains, and just kind of experimenting on different varieties and different ways to grow. So I just wanted to give you guys a visual of how, what flour comes from. So right here, this golden color, this is camu. Next to it, this is turkey red. That's an heirloom wheat as well. Here is spelt and rye. And so this is what goes in. This is an example of a mill. Whoops. Oh, what did I do? So this goes in, the grains kind of go in this hopper, and then the stones are in here, and then it comes out here. I won't turn it on because it's incredibly loud, but that's.
Essie's breads are really unique that way in locally because she actually clearly grinds her own grains right in her own kitchen, which is pretty awesome and unique. And I agree with you. I think that the grain scene is totally picking up, and I'm not even that much of, I'm a little bit of a bread nerd, but I don't make it, I just eat it. But yeah, it's pretty awesome. I do have a couple follow-up questions until we get into the next thing.
Yes.
Beth wants to know, does it matter what kind of bowl you use for your dough? So does it have to be porous or non-porous or like those kind of things?
No, I tend to use like a stainless steel, but I don't think that it really matters.
Okay. And also, so you said that we would see the starter bubble. If we used to see it but no longer do, and a skin is forming daily, is the starter going bad? Does that mean that the starter's going bad if there's a skin over the dough?
No, skin's okay. You can just peel it back, and it just needs a feed. You can also keep, especially as it's getting hotter, you can keep your sourdough starter in the refrigerator.
Okay, Lisa, let me know if that answers your question or if you need follow-up.
It does, but I have a question with what she just said.
Sure.
So if we keep it in the fridge, do we still feed it on a daily basis?
No, you don't need to.
Okay. So it's okay in the hot weather to still have it on the counter if we're feeding it daily?
Oh, yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, because mine's forms, I feed it daily and it still forms the skin every day. I've been just stirring it in, but I no longer see it bubble. I used to. I don't know why it stopped bubbling.
Oh, even after you feed it.
Yeah. It still smells like sourdough smell. I still use it.
Yeah. Is it leavening?
Yeah.
Yeah. It just might have lost a bit of strength. You might want to give it like a bulk feed, and then so we can
more water, more flour.
Yeah, with a like less percentage of the starter.
Okay. Yeah, I actually tried a little sugar, thinking maybe it like chocolate like me. It like sugar. So just more of the flour water. I'll do that then.
Yeah, give that a
Do you
try.
use bread flour or like an all-purpose?
It depends on I would say whatever your starter is used to.
Okay.
It really likes consistency. Yeah. So some people use all rye, some people use 50-50. So it just kind of depends on what it has been created with. And you can always change it, but I would do it gradually, mix it in. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about gluten, and then we'll talk about next the nutrition and digestibility. Sound like a plan? So this was an example that I showed you about the gluten development. So it's the two protein chains, and they become very elastic, as you saw. So think of the gluten string sort of like a latex balloon. So as they get stronger, they're going to get more elastic and hold more. And so what's in here, what's happening is, so the gluten development is coming on, and then as we fold it and strengthen the dough, the lactic acid bacteria that's working in here is creating that carbon dioxide. And so we're trapping those bubbles. And as the gluten, if it holds its strength in your bread making, then you're going to have a nice oven rise. And that is when the carbon dioxide has been produced by the culture, and the bread is introduced to the heat of the oven, and that gas has to escape somewhere. And so typically, ideally, you want it to come up and out, and that happens through cutting the skin of the dough, which is called scoring. So that is sort of how it kind of comes up and leavens like that. It's through the carbon dioxide being trapped by the gluten. So this creates, the oven spring, and it can be kind of small, it can be quite dramatic, and it sort of depends on technique, on fermentation time. There's a lot of variables that can change that. So that brings us a little bit to nutrition. Gluten sensitivity and intolerance, are widely documented. So sourdough culture, the lactic acid bacteria specifically, as it ferments, it transforms the wheat. So think of it like, so the word autolyse is basically like self-digestion. So the wheat is being broken down. Oh, good job. Give me 2 minutes, okay? So, let me get my thought back. So
the wheat is being or the fermentation transforms the wheat and
yes,
kind of breaks it down. You're welcome.
So the wheat is being transformed, it's being broken down. So there's an anti-nutrient in wheat that's naturally occurring called phytic acid. And the lactic acid bacteria breaks this down. Phytic acid is often associated with that bloating feeling, that very heavy feeling that nearly everyone gets after pizza, right? So it's naturally occurring in the wheat. And so the sourdough culture breaks that down. And this might be one of the reasons that people with gluten intolerance can tolerate sourdough a little better. So this takes us a little bit back to ancient cultures too, because everything was fermented back then. Everything was used, with sourdough. And so we think, well, why are all these changes now? We've had changes in farming, we've had changes in the varieties of wheat, decreasing the biodiversity greatly, and we've had dramatic changes in fermentation. Hardly any bread, unless if it's made, in this style, is fermented. So the fermentation, in addition to breaking down phytic acid, it unlocks a whole host of nutrients that we would otherwise pass, because our digestive system is relatively fast. So when wheat is fermented, it unlocks vitamins E, K, the B1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 9, and B12, and choline. For the minerals, it unlocks calcium, iron, magnesium, manganese, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, zinc, and selenium. So when we think back to those ancient cultures and what a staple bread was to their daily diets, you're thinking they're getting all of these vitamins, the minerals, the phytochemicals, the proteins. It makes sense people ate bread with every meal, because there's very few foods that can pack so much in there that were cheap, and accessible to the masses. So the nutrition that comes from fermentation is so much greater than a yeasted bread. A yeasted bread is too fast, and so it doesn't break down in the same way as a fermented sourdough, and it doesn't have the lactic acid bacteria to do the work. So a little bit more on lactic acid bacteria, it is real. There's more and more coming out about the gut-brain axis, and so there's a lot of really cool research going on. There's actually as much communication between our guts and our brains as in 4 spinal cords. I mean, it's so amazing at how much there is to discover about this pathway. And so when we think of our gut, and I'm sure you guys have talked a lot about microbiome in this series.
That we have, yep. But please reiterate, and it's from this perspective.
So the microbiome it's just the community that lives in our intestines. And so they protect us from disease. They make the nutrients more available for us to absorb. It's the first line of defense in our immune system. And so sourdough breads often have 10 to 15% higher in resistant starch. And what that is, it's basically food for our microbiota, that beneficial bacteria in our guts. It feeds them. And so there's hundreds of different types of bacteria living in our guts. And they influence our mental health, they influence our immune system, our stress management, even aspects of our personality. So lactic acid bacteria actually produces GABA, which is a neurotransmitter, and that directly affects stress management and personality. Serotonin is made in our guts. So when you think of the fallout of good or bad microbiome, healthy or unhealthy, it's really all-encompassing. Our well-being very much stems from the well-being of our gut. So fiber is super important, and sourdough breads can be an important source of fiber, both for our body and for that community of beneficial bacteria. So if we don't have enough fiber, that bacteria can start to attack the lining of our intestines. And what can happen is if it's not adequately lined, those undigested proteins can seep into the bloodstream, and that causes an immune response, often associated with inflammation. So it's important to be feeding that microbiome. And with the fermented bread, that's also introducing, more microbiota, increased diversity into your gut microbiome. The more diverse, the more robust, the more healthy, and the more it's being fed, the more there's a sealed lining to protect your own body. That way you're not getting these crazy immune reactions when things are kind of seeping through the gaps, if there's not, that layer of defense. So sourdough breads can really support a healthy microbiome. They can be definitely a very tasty way to bolster your health. You can bake with a variety of grains. There are so many out there. These are just a couple that I showed you. And that biodiversity really helps support a healthy microbiome. Using stone milled flours and grains, I would definitely advocate for, because you are able to retain the fiber, you're able to retain all of the vitamins and minerals that surrounds that endosperm, which just ends up being carbohydrates and proteins. So when available, if you can find stone milled grains, go for it. And then the acidification through lactic acid bacteria and a slow fermentation will also help support that, the microbiome.
I just had a quick question that I wanted to field from Lisa. So I just, a clarification, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but sourdough bread isn't gluten-free. It's just less gluten because a lot of the gluten is broken down, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
but so I'll tell you the research and then you can take that.
Okay.
With this super long fermentation, there's a study out of Belgium where they looked at a 48-hour fermentation of an all wheat sourdough bread. And after that 48-hour fermentation, so the American standards, oh gosh, now I'm on the spot. The American for gluten-free,
I feel like we talked about this. I remember it's pretty small.
I think it's 24 parts per million. And I am thinking that it came back as like 9 parts per million. So it was definitely significantly under the threshold for our American standard. So that gives you an indication of how much the gluten degrades during a long fermentation. Now, if you're only fermenting for 4 hours, clearly that's going to come back different. There will be more gluten. But the research is really up in the air, I'll have to say, because coming out of both Belgium and the UK, there's the most recent research is indicating a fruits and molecule chain might be what is really responsible for people's reactions, which is a sugar chain. And that's also naturally occurring in wheat and a couple other foods as well. So it's hard to tell exactly, is it the gluten degrading? Is it the sugars, being transformed?
And it could be how it's reacting in the person's gut too. Because it's like, what's that environment like, and how is that changing things, and how is that making things bioavailable? Or if there's already gaps in the lining, you might already be in trouble, and you have to heal that before you don't have a reaction of some sort.
It's so complex, and there really isn't a one-size-fits-all. And it's like anything else, you just have to kind of look at your own body and make choices that are best for you.
Good call. You sound like and also, just to clarify, can you just give kind of a little, I mean, I know you talked about it kind of in depth, but as far as like, would you ever add yeast to a sourdough bread? Like if you...
Yeah. There's a couple reasons to do. It could be rounding out flavor. It could be just sort of having like a better control of your rise. Like a lot of bakeries do like just a pinch of yeast, again, just to have a consistency, because there is a lot of variability in a culture depending on, the feed, the weather, the type of flour that you're using.
So would you say the yeast kind of almost acts as a little bit of a stabilizer, or like a factor that you can help control your bread a little more?
It adds a little bit of a more like a control factor, I would say. Again, you want to make sure that the primary leavening is the sourdough culture, because you want the bacteria. That's what we're after. Okay. And you also want to make sure that's going through a fermentation. You don't want... So there's a big like sourdough movement, because sourdough is having a big moment, and so a lot of corporations have kind of caught on to the trend. And so I would say if there's colorants, if there's additives, if there's preservatives, that's probably not sourdough. If there is some yeast in it, then there's usually, that's, as long as the primary leavening is the sourdough and it's going through fermentation, I think that's fine, because some recipes do require like a pre-ferment, which is a pinch of yeast, a little bit of flour and water, and that creates like a very stiff addition to the dough. And so there's various reasons for using that kind of application.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Sure. So,
can I ask a question?
Oh, please.
When you say as long as the sourdough starter is the primary raising agent, however you worded that, and you just use a pinch, like I have a recipe that I've used several times, and it's 3/4 of a cup of the sourdough starter, but you use a whole teaspoon of yeast. And I've oftentimes wondered, you know, what's the, I mean, obviously I'm putting more starter in. Is that still the primary rising agent, or because there's a whole, and it makes 2 loaves, but you know what I'm saying? I'm wondering, can I cut back on the yeast?
I would say definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, 'cause it sounds, I mean, a teaspoon of yeast goes a long way for 2 loaves.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, if you're using the culture, that really should be doing it for you.
Okay.
But there's nothing wrong with commercial yeast. You know, it's not really gonna harm or take away from your bread. I think it's more of like coming from someone who might be like a sourdough purist would say no. But you know, there's lots of applications to use both. Yeah, I don't.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, nutritionally wise, I think what matters is the use of the bacteria and fermentation. Yeah, I think. But again, everyone will have their own opinion on that. So we talked a little bit about the microbiome, about how the microbiome interacts with kind of the whole body, mind body, a little bit about the effects of fermentation on grain, stone milling. Any other kind of details you want to go over in regards to that stuff?
Essie, can you talk a little bit about like some of your personal sourcing that you use for your breads and your baked goods, as far as, you know, where you get things from, how much quality matters in your opinion, and if do you get anything fairly locally as far as your grains go?
We have a couple good options. There's 2 mills relatively close. There's Small Valley Milling and Castle Valley. And then there's also Echo Hill that can get a whole lot of things for you, and a lot of variety that, you know, that aren't grown here necessarily. And you can get things that are, you know, whole berries like I showed you, or also pre-milled. So I think that if you're interested, there's a lot of opportunity to source from PA grains, and also things that are grown more in the Northwest where the climate's more conducive. So, I think that when you're able to, I would encourage the organic grains, because there really is evidence, you know, especially the study that I cited earlier about the lactic acid bacteria. I really do think that it makes a difference in our body systems. You know, it's not always possible, but when possible, you know, it's good to go that route.
I would agree with that for sure. That just typically means it's a lot cleaner and it's not sprayed with anything to make it go to seed and things like that. So it's just, especially if you already have a sensitivity, if you have a cleaner grain, you'll be even less likely for it to affect you in a negative way.
Yeah. So if there's no questions, I'll kind of go over a little bit about actually baking the bread. So I just did, I might have to reposition the camera here. So this has had some time, probably not quite enough time. Let me see what we can do. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to.
No, we're staying with you. I appreciate you doing this. I know it's not easy.
Okay, I'll try to do one hand because I can't get it to stay at that angle. So you're gonna, after your dough has set, and maybe we'll do a follow-up class that we can actually make bread together when this is all done.
I love that.
So we'll shape it into a round, after you've divided it. And then you usually, after a pre-shape, you usually let it sit a little bit. And then you're gonna flip it over. We're gonna pretend I let that sit for like a half hour, 45 minutes, and kind of spread it out. And again, it should be like really nice and silky. And you're just gonna kind of fold it over itself like 4 times. Sorry, I don't usually do this one-handed. And then what we're gonna do is try to create surface tension. So we're gonna I'm just scraping my hands. Let me move it back so maybe you can see, like this, across, and then turn it, across, and then turn it. So we're using that, we're trying to tighten up the skin of the dough. So it's nice and taut and smooth like that. And when it's, I don't know if I can show you, when it's ready, you should be able to sort of see your fingerprint linger just for a second. And that's when it's ready to go into a banneton. So bread making is really, it doesn't require much. You can use any bowl in your kitchen. Flour and water are pretty easy to come by, well, maybe not now, but used to. And salt. So, and that it just takes time. So we're talking a couple hours of kind of folding it, letting it sit. And again, if you guys are interested, maybe we can do a more hands-on later on. So this is a banneton, but you can also just take a tea towel, rub flour in that, line a bowl, and then you just flip your little dough ball upside down in it. And then you can either do an ambient fermentation, or I always do a long cold fermentation in the fridge for like about 24 hours.
And what's the difference between those two, Essie?
What's that?
What's the difference between those two? The ambient, like it just sits?
Yeah, so the ambient is just in a couple hours and it's gonna ferment here. And so it's not gonna be as long, but the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria will be more active. When you put it in the refrigerator, the yeast drops down to about like 2%, but the lactic acid bacteria keeps going. So it's not gonna rise a whole lot in your fridge, but that breaking down is still gonna be going on. So that's why I usually choose a cold fermentation. And then this is Dutch oven. A lot of people have different versions of this guy. This is just a really simple one from Lodge. It's called, I think it's called a conversion cooker. And if you don't already have one and you're interested in doing bread making, I would really recommend this one because you can cook it in the lid. And so you don't have to like drop, like, this is like 500 degrees. You don't have to like drop it in the pot. So it saves a lot of potential burns. And so after your fermentation, you're just gonna flip it, this way into, this will be preheated, pretend, right? And then this is the lamb. So it's, basically just a razor blade on a stick. You can use a flexible razor blade with a coffee stirrer. If you don't want to buy one, it's just, you can just freehand. It doesn't require a lot. And so scoring, it was, back when we used community ovens, scoring was a way to identify your family bread. So typically every family would have their own special score. but it also controls the way that gas escapes. It controls the oven spring. So that gas is going to go somewhere, and it will push out at the weakest spot of the dough. And so if you don't score it, that's fine, but it will just kind of like bust out wherever it wants. And so that's why we typically score it in the manner that we want it to rise. So when you do score your bread, think, if it's a circle like this, think symmetrical, because the gas is going to be forced up wherever you cut it. If you cut it like on the side only, then that opening will come only there. So a lot of like the rounds loaves have more symmetrical lines, the oblong a little bit different. Oh, I was going to show you a cooked one. Just 1 minute. Okay, so this is an example of scoring of it baked. See what I mean? How it kind of puffs up where I made the weak spot? Like that. And so to do that, you just simply, you're just gonna slash the dough, like 1/4 of an inch. And you can be as intricate as you want or as simple as you want. And it just, there's so many different designs. You could go down the rabbit hole on Instagram looking at all the beautiful scoring. But essentially that's what it does. It creates a weak spot in the dough to control the oven spring. After that, you put the lid on and pop it in your oven. Now the reason home bakers use the Dutch oven for bread is for the crust. So if you put this directly into your oven, chances are there won't be enough steam, even if you do a steam tray or a spray bottle, for your crust to stay soft enough for that oven spring to be complete. Using the heavy pot with a lid traps all the water in the dough and lets that crust stay soft enough to expand. And then the last 10 or 15 minutes of the bake, you take the lid off and then allow that moisture to evaporate and the crust to firm up. So if the crust forms too early, then you won't get that oven spring, and your dough will be like a little bit underdone and gummy because it has nowhere to go. So that's like kind of a quick introduction on the steps of bread making.
I have a question. My friend Emily's here, and she says she's really into sourdough discard recipes.
Yeah.
And so she wanted to ask if you have a favorite way to use discard, and also can you explain what that means, because I don't make bread and I don't know what that means.
Yeah, well, sourdough discard is like the leftover that you don't use for your bread formula.
Gotcha.
And so it can pile up on you. And so there's lots and lots of ways that people are using the starter. I actually have not experimented very much with that because I rarely have extra time to do it. But yeah, I use a formula, so I just make exactly what I need. So I don't have a whole lot of extra, but I'm sure you could teach me something.
Emily, feel free if you want to share anything, or if you have any good sources for those recipes that you're using. If you want to share them, they can be in the chat box, and then I'll share that later to the group and to people that missed it. Essie, can you talk a little bit about some of your kind of, if people are interested in getting a little more creative with some of their additional ingredients, so whether maybe it's kind of more unique grains, or if they want to add some spices or nuts or seeds, and how that might affect the bake. or some things to think about? Maybe some just tips on how to get a little more creative and add some additional ingredients?
Absolutely. I think, the multi-grain breads and combinations are really wonderful, and you can get super creative. And that's a really nice thing. A lot of the formulas out there is, you think like more proportion. So if you're making 2 loaves of bread, think like 1,000 total weight. So you could throw in camu, purple barley, wheat and spelt all together. You can just like kind of throw everything together, and as long as it equals 1,000 grams, and as long as your water is between, well, with that combination, that would be kind of a thirsty flour. So like maybe around like 800 grams. And then your starter is going to be about 20%, so about 200. Salt's about 2%, so about 20. Then it should work. And you can experiment as much as you want. So you want to think about 1,000 grams of flour, anywhere between 7 to 8 to start out with water. And as you kind of get the feel for the dough, you can play with the hydration level all the way up to 95% if you want. Then your leaven is going to be about 20%, so about 200, and your salt about 20 grams. So, and you can really, like, it's amazing. You can make quinoa and fold that in. You can make oatmeal, like a porridge bread. You can do all kinds of nuts and seeds, garlic, jalapenos. Like it's endless. As creative as you want to be, you can make inclusions, and if you want to fold in seeds or olives or whatever, you're going to do that in the very last stages of folding your bread. That way you have enough strength, gluten strength, to hold in those heavy ingredients. So don't mix it in straight away. Let that dough develop, and then in the last hour of your bulk, you can fold those in. Yeah, like maybe a quarter, and then fold over the dough and layer it so it gets dispersed evenly. Does that make sense?
I think so. Any tips on, because I know you mentioned a couple things that would add extra moisture. Can that cause problems? I know I've watched enough British baking to to know that sometimes if you have things that have too much moisture, it could totally mess up your bake.
Yeah. So you're gonna, right, if you're making something with more moisture like oatmeal, then you're gonna be doing more like 700 grams of water versus 800 grams of water. Yeah, hold back. And as you bake, you're gonna learn the feel of the dough, and as you're adding the water, sometimes it will feel too very, very wet, and it's just part of the learning experience. Everybody, every grain, like camu is very thirsty, so that sucks up a whole lot of water versus like just a straight white bread flour. So if you put in, 850 grams of water with just white bread flour, it's going to be really hard to work with. But camu, it's going to need that much because it will be a stiffer dough.
One time, I don't bake because I'm of this exact science thing. I'm not that great at it. I should do it more to get better. But one time I made, I think I was making brownies or something, and I had found this quinoa flour, and it is super thirsty. Like,
yes.
Oh my goodness! I was like, where did the liquid go? It's gone. It's gone. So it just ate it up. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah.
So you said, I just want to make sure I have these correct. 1,000. So your typical recipe, as far as weights go, 1,000 grams of flour, between 700 and 800 grams of water. Did you say 20 grams of salt?
Mm-hmm.
And then, what did I miss?
Leaven.
Yes.
Or starter.
Your starter. And what was the weight on that typically?
200.
Okay. Gotcha. I just want to put it in my notes so that when I create my notes later, it's there. Does anybody have any additional questions for Essie? That was really great and informative, and really happy you were able to make it tonight, Essie.
I actually had a question.
Yeah, go for it, Lisa.
You were saying the olives and seeds you would do towards after the first rising, you'd fold it in. So if you're doing nuts, you do it around the same time?
Yeah, anything that I would add in, I would do in the last hour.
Okay, so how does that change if you're using like an almond flour?
Oh, well, the flour would be fine because it doesn't have the weights. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just just anything that would have weight, like even you know, like if you wanted to add chopped up rosemary or something, that would interact very differently than walnuts.
Okay.
You want the dough to be strong enough to hold it.
Okay, gotcha.
Someone might have joined us a little late, and they just said about the basics of creating your starter. Can you just go over those real quick?
Oh, sure. The easiest way, it's going to take about a week, is to mix a tablespoon of flour and a tablespoon of water, and just lightly cover it with a tea towel so it can absorb the ambient yeast and lactic acid bacteria. Just make sure it's nice and smooth and mixed up. And then the next day, you can discard half of that and then add another tablespoon of flour, tablespoon of water. You're going to repeat that for like 5 days. You'll start to see the carbon dioxide, those little bubbles, and it will start, to smell. And as it gets active, like around day anywhere from 5 to 7, you could start to give it its first bulk feed. Yep.
Cool. Any other additional questions for you guys? Beth says you're delightful and she can't wait to do it in person.
If anyone's having trouble getting starter going, I'm happy to drop off at Farmhouse, a little container to get you going.
Oh, that would be fantastic. I'm sure if anyone wants to take Essie up on that, let me know. Send me your email address and say starter please or something like that, and I'll hook you up and we'll get that for you. Thank you so much. That is such a sweet offer. Anybody else? All right, well, I'll just let you guys know that I will have this available, and I'll have some follow-up notes hopefully in the next week or so. And Essie, thank you so much, and I'll definitely take you up when we're able to meet again, hopefully in person, and we can all gather again when this is all calmed down. We would love to have you in a Farmhouse to have an actual in-person bread making class. So thank you so much for being so great and for manning your own camera and doing this from home. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was delightful.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you guys. Thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks guys. Have a great night.
You too.